All right, guys, now we're going to take a look at how the country is changing and entering a new era.
1817. The dawn of the era of good feelings arrived with the fifth president, James Monroe, who hoped to make the bitter disputes of war and party politics a distant memory. The 58-year-old Virginian had been Madison's Secretary of State and also eventually his Secretary of War.
James Monroe, if you talk about the last founding era president, he's an appropriate guy to be the last one. He supposedly, well into his old age, was the last guy still dressing like these earlier founders did in the knee breeches and the stockings. People had moved on to real pants by that point.
He was the last of his kind. He was the last president to wear a tricorn hat. He was the last president, really, who was part of the revolutionary generation. He was the last of the founders to be president.
With the executive mansion still being rebuilt, Monroe kicked off his presidency with a tour of the nation by horse and carriage, visiting New England and traveling as far west as Detroit. Not since Washington had a president toured the country and gotten so close to the people, and it was a huge success.
The nation's economy is booming. New York is building the Erie Canal. And so this is expanding an economy quite rapidly. Monroe presides over this. Monroe probably has one of the happiest presidencies of any president. There's no great crisis. There's no war. When I think of Monroe, I think of Dwight Eisenhower. Both presided by and large over peace and prosperity, and both suffer in some ways for it. Historians tend to focus on the melodramatic presidents, the swashbuckling figures who find themselves confronting great crises. What about presidents who avoid crises?
Now, this era is often called the era of good feelings. And in 1816, James Monroe is elected president. You kind of saw he's a little bit of a throwback to the Revolutionary Era. Federalists had all but disappeared, and nobody ran against him in 1820 when he would get reelected. And so that's why it was called the era of good feelings. It was basically everybody was a Democratic Republican. And Monroe is sort of the perfect guy. He's very unassuming. He presides over a very peaceful time period in the nation's history. And so a lot of times we forget how sort of critical he was to this transition in the nation's history, because so much of the focus is on Congress. And you have three men who step forward who are going to define the next era of American politics from the congressional side, at least. And you have Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. Clay represents the western states. He thinks the nation needs better transportation, better roads and canals. And he's going to propose a compromise that's going to help put some of that into place. You've got Daniel Webster, who favors higher tariffs to protect the industry and the shipping of the northeastern states. And then you have John C. Calhoun, who's the senator from South Carolina, and he really represents those southern states, that idea of states' rights, and that those ideas and the smaller federal government needs to be preserved, and that should be our main focus as a nation. And so what goes along with building this national identity is also building up the economy. So in 1811, the first bank of the U.S. had lost its charter. The state banks were issuing too many loans and money. It caused a huge economic panic. So in 1816, the Bank of the U.S. is created to control the money supply and stabilize the economy once again. Monroe signs that into law, along with a tariff of 1816 that allowed because the American industry had grown so rapidly because of the Embargo Act and the War of 1812. British goods were cheaper and they wanted to sell them in the U.S. again. But this was the time period when American industry was starting to emerge, and we'll talk about that in our next lecture. And so there was a desire to protect that. So you place a tariff on it, you make foreign goods more expensive, encourage people to buy American goods. It's popular in the North. South hated it because it meant that they had to spend more money on American goods when the British goods might be cheaper. Henry Clay tried to help everybody with this compromise, the American system. The high tariff would stay in place. It would allow Northerners to buy crops from the West and South and allow the federal government to pay for roads and canals using the tax money. The roads and canals would make finished products cheaper as they would reach the South and West faster, but they weren't supported by Congress and the Southern members of Congress, so a lot of it didn't pass because a lot of people thought this wasn't the federal government's job, that these were the jobs of the states, and that sort of sank a lot of Clay's efforts in the political realm with his American system. At the same time, we have another major Supreme Court case, the case of McCullough v. Maryland. The state of Maryland wanted to pass a tax on the Bank of the United States because it was an out-of-state bank. But Chief Justice John Marshall brought that said the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And according to the Constitution, the federal government is superior to the states. It's part of that supremacy clause, and therefore that tax is illegal. You can't pass a law that violates the federal law or the Constitution. And this strengthens the power of the federal government, makes it a much more stronger body. The lasting legacy of James Monroe comes in the form of the Monroe Doctrine. Spain was attempting to regain their colonies in Latin America. There's a border dispute between the British in Canada and the Russians who controlled Alaska. And because all these countries were fighting over territory that was thousands of miles away from their homelands, Monroe said the Americas were not to be viewed as future colonies by any nation. That you stay on your half of the world, we'll stay on ours, and everything will be just fine.
Monroe used his second term to flex the country's muscle on the international stage.
James Monroe, one of the things that he does is say that the New World and the Old World are two separate worlds.
Monroe Doctrine becomes a centerpiece of American foreign policy. Monroe is saying the Caribbean is our bathtub, we get to play in it. South America, Central America is our sphere of influence.
The Monroe Doctrine would be cited as a precedent by many future presidents. William McKinley used it to justify the Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt used it to build the Panama Canal. JFK would cite it when he blocked Soviet ships from Cuba. It has proven to be one of the longest-lasting legacies of the first presidents.
One reason why Monroe, I think, is not more memorable is because it's tough to think of much of what he ever said that was quotable. Even the doctrine that bears his name was largely the handiwork of his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. But James Monroe gave us 8 years of peace and prosperity, and that ought to be judged a success for any president.
I think when you look at the sort of founding era presidents, you can say that they're baseline presidents. Each president had a proving moment, and in one way or another, I think each president proved himself.
In the end, Monroe would leave as Washington, Jefferson, and Madison had. He declined to run for a third term and returned home to his estate in Virginia. It was the end of an era for the American presidency.
Thanks, guys, for paying attention. Hopefully we took good notes.